Chapter 18: The Rise of Russia. New rulers often face a special challenge of legitimacy. Why should people accept their rule and their policies? The Russian Tsars, spelled Tsars, of the 15th-16th century faced just such a challenge. They claimed the right to dominate Russia and orchestrate steady expansion of territory. How could they persuade the people that their power was legitimate? Early Tsars, particularly Ivan III and Ivan IV, proved particularly inventive. First, they pointed out their family tree, noting their descent from the line of Rurik, the legendary founder of Russia. Ivan IV had huge genealogy books prepared, ignoring the claims of other descendants. The early Tsar also invoked the example of the Roman Empire, speaking of Russia as the third Rome, after Byzantium and Rome itself. This had appeal. Rome was a much-admired state from the classical past, and Byzantium added up an element of Christian mission. Russia could be presented as a protector of the faith. Ivan IV's genealogies were thus filled with lives of the saints and church resolutions, designed to show how God's purpose from creation onward had been to found a truly Christian empire, and how Russia was now called to fulfill this purpose. Russia's ruler was often portrayed as in religious terms as leader of the Holy Church as part of the divine mission. See figure 18.1. But even this was not enough. As Ivan IV's campaign in Central Asia, he also invoked the heritage of the Mongols. Russia should rule in Central Asia, according to this argument, because it was the long-standing property of the Rurik dynasty, which was nonsense historically, but sounded good. Because it was his duty as a Christian monarch to extirpate the rule of the infidel, and because, having defeated the Mongols, he had become a Khan himself. And sure enough, at the time and thereafter, Muslim leaders often took oaths of loyalty to the Tsar on the Quran, and the Tsar styled himself in that region the Khan of the North. 3 lessons may be taken from all this that are important for Russian and world history alike. First, Tsars claim a lot. Second, their claims embodied significant contradictions. Were they Khans claiming arbitrary authority over the masses, or were they benevolent, gentle Christians? And third, precisely because Russian expansion touched so many different regions and traditions, the new empire would have inevitably be complex and multifaceted. It came to embrace many different peoples, and its size inevitably challenged the capacity of Russia's rulers. This chapter focuses strongly on Russian expansion and Tsarist power, but also on social conditions that distinguished Russia during a crucial period in the nation's development. Russia's expansionist politics under the Tsars. Russia's emergence as a new power in Eastern Europe and Central Asia initially depended on its gaining freedom from Mongol Tatar control. The Duchy of Moscow was the center of the liberation effort beginning in the 14th century. Local princes began to carve out greater autonomy, and the effectiveness of Mongol control began to diminish. Ironically, the Moscow princes initially gained political experience as tax collectors from the Mongols, but gradually they moved toward regional independence. Under Ivan III, Ivan the Great, 1462 to 1505, who claimed succession from the Rurik dynasty in the old Kievan days, a large Russian territory emerged. Ivan organized a strong army, giving the new government a military emphasis it would long retain. By 1480, Moscow had been freed from any payment to the Mongols, and Ivan had gained a vast kingdom running from the borders of the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom to the Ural Mountains. Russia's rise had some similarities to earlier Macedonian and Roman expansion, a new state on the fringes of the civilized world, suddenly and steadily gaining great power. The new Russian Empire, important in its own right, also formed one of the most one of the novel varieties of empire introduced in the early modern period as a whole. The need for revival. Mongol control never reshaped basic Russian values, but the rulers were interested in tribute, not full government. Many Russian landlords adopted Mongol styles of dress and social habits. However, most Russians remained Christians, and most local administrative issues remained in the hands of regional princes, landlords, or peasant villages. In these senses, Russia was set to resume many of its earlier patterns when full independence was achieved. On the other hand, the Mongol period had reduced the vigor of Russian cultural life, lowering the levels of literacy among the priesthood, for example. Economic life deteriorated as well. With trade down and manufacturing limited, Russia had become a purely agricultural economy dependent on peasant labor. In these senses, independence brought a challenge for revival and reform. Ivan the Great claimed an earlier tradition on centralized rule, which went back to the Rurik dynasty in Byzantine precedents, and added to it this new senses of imperial mission. He married the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, which gave him the chance to assert control over Orthodox churches, whether in Russia or not. The idea of Russia as a third Rome explained why Ivan called himself Tsar, or Caesar, the autocrat of all the Russians. From Ivan III onward, early modern Russians was strongly shaped by military needs. Mongol counterattacks were a legitimate concern. A Tatar group sacked Moscow as late as 1571, but Russia's rulers also pressed conquest beyond defense. They seized additional territory from the Tatars in what is now Ukraine, and also in Central Asia through the 16th century, and they also began to expand in East Central Europe, which brought them face to face with other military opponents. To recruit soldiers, the Tsars began to grant hereditary territories to military nobles. This includes strict controls over the peasant serfs on these lands. Harsh conditions caused many serfs to flee to border regions with two results. First, regulations on remaining serfs tightened to tie them to the land, lest a severe border shortage develop. This launched a pattern of constraints on serfs that was in marked contrast to trends in Western Europe at the same time. Where serfdom was easing up, peasants who fled, however, helped provide both military muscle and labor for further Russian expansion, for example, into Siberia. Cossack colonies formed from independent peasant fighting men, played a great role in Russian success. Powers of the aristocratic landlords, called boyars, also led to conflicts with the claims of the Tsars, who wanted to rule without interference. These conflicts dotted Russian history in the 16th and 17th centuries, before the boyars were finally put down. This pattern, along with the deep-seated and durable pressures on the serfs, defined key developments in Russia even beyond the early modern centuries. The next important Tsar, Ivan IV, 1533 to 1584, just called Ivan the Terrible, continued the trends of Russian expansion and consolidation of power. He placed great emphasis on prompting the Tsarist aristocracy, earning his nickname by killing or exiling many of the Russian boyars, whom he suspected of conspiracy. The Tsar often flew into violent rages. During one episode, he killed his son and heir, followed by deep religious repentance. His conquests were largely successful, however, and there were other key gains, such as the introduction of printing into Russia. Patterns of expansion. Russia's creation of a vast landed empire propelled it into new importance in world history, with direct impact ultimately on Europe, East Asia, and Central Asia and the Middle East. Steady territorial expansion policy was motivated by a desire to push the former Mongol overlords farther back. Russia was a country of vast plains, with few natural barriers to invasion. The early Tsars turned their drawback this drawback to an advantage by pushing southward toward the Caspian Sea. They also moved east into the Ural Mountains and beyond. Both Ivan III and Ivan IV recruited peasants to migrate to the newly seized lands, particularly in the south, and the efforts to flee serfdom provided another stimulus. These peasant adventurers, or Cossacks, were Russian pioneers, combining agriculture and daring military feats on horseback. The expansion territories long had a rough and steady frontier quality, only gradually settling down to more regular administration. The Cossack spirit provided volunteers for further expansion for many of the pioneers, like their American counterparts in the 19th century. In the 19th century, chafed under detailed Tsarist control and were eager to move on to new settlements. During the 16th century, the Cossacks not only conquered the Caspian Sea area, but also moved into western Siberia across the Urals, beginning the gradual takeover and settlement of these vast plains, which previously had been sparsely inhabited by nomadic Asian peoples. Map 18.1. Expansion also allowed Tsars to continue to reward loyal nobles and bureaucrats by giving them estates in new territories. This practice provided new agricultural areas and sources of labor. Russia used slaves for certain kinds of production work in the 18th century, although Russia never became as dependent on expansion for social control and economic advance as in the later Roman Empire or the Ottoman Empire. It certainly had many reasons to continue the policy. Russia also created trading connections with its new Asian territories and their neighbors. Russia's early expansion, along with that of the Ottoman Empire to the south, eliminated independent Central Asia, the age-old source of nomadic cultures and periodic invasions in both the east and the west. The same invasion, though driven by the movement of Russian peasants and the landlords to new areas, also added to Russia diverse new peoples, making this a multicultural empire like that of the Mongols and Ottomans. Particularly important was the addition of a large Muslim minority, overseen by the Tsarist government, but not pressed to integrate with Russian culture. Western contact and Romanov policy. Although, along with expansion and enforcement of Tsarist primacy, the early Tsars added one element to their overall approach: carefully managed contacts with Western Europe. The Tsars realized that Russia's cultural and economic subordination to the Mongols had put them at a commercial and cultural disadvantage. Ivan III was eager to launch diplomatic missions to the leading Western states. During the reign of Ivan IV, British merchants established trading contacts with Russia, selling manufactured products in exchange for furs and other raw materials. Soon, Western merchants established outposts in Moscow and other Russian centers. The Tsars also imported Italian artists and architects to design church buildings and the magnificent royal palace in the Kremlin in Moscow. The foreign architects modified Renaissance styles to take Russian building traditions into account, producing the ornate, onion-shaped domes that became characteristic of Russia and other East European churches, and creating a distinctive form of classism, a tradition of looking to the West, particularly for emblems of upper-class art and status, was beginning to emerge by the 16th century, along with some reliance on Western commercial initiative. Figure 18.2. Ivan IV died without an heir. This led to some power claims by the boyars, the time of troubles, 1604 to 1613, when nobles competed with each other for power, plus Swedish and Polish attacks on Russian territory. In 1613, an assembly of boyars chose a member of the Romanov family as Tsars. This family, the Romanov dynasty, was to rule Russia until the Great Revolution of 1917. Although many individual Romanov rulers were weak, and tensions with the claims of nobles recurred, The time of troubles did not produce any lasting constraints on Tsarist power. The first Romanov, Michael, reestablished internal order without great difficulty. He also drove out the foreign invaders and resumed the expansionist policy of his predecessor. A successful war against Poland brought Russia part of the Ukraine, including Kiev. In the south, Russia's boundaries expanded to meet those of the Ottoman Empire. Expansion at this point was beginning to have new diplomatic implications as Russia encountered other established governments. Alexis Romanov, Michael's successor, abolished the assemblies of nobles and gained new powers over the Russian churches, as was eager to purge the church of many superstitions and errors that, in his judgment, had crept in during Mongol times. His policies resumed the orthodox tradition of state control over the church. Dissident religious conservatives, called Old Believers, were exiled to Siberia or to southern Russia, where they maintained their religion and extended Russia's colonizing activities. Measures to tighten serfdom continued, with new laws binding peasants to the land and restricted their opportunities to travel. Serfdom runaways were harshly punished. In 1670, a great serf revolt under Stefan Razin declared freedom from landlord control, but it was finally put down by Tsarist troops. Russia's first westernization, 1690 to 1790. By the end of the 17th century, Russia had become one of the great land empires, but it remained usually agricultural by the standards of the West and the great Asian civilizations. The reign of Peter I, the son of Alexis, and known with some justice as Peter the Great, built many new features into his framework between 1689 and 1725. In essence, Peter extended his predecessor's policies for building up Tsarist control and expanding Russian territory, map 18.2. He added a more definite interest in changing selected aspects of Russian economy and culture by imitating Western forms. Peter's basic motives were familiar enough. He wanted to further Tsarist power and enhance Russia's military strength. Early setbacks in war with Sweden convinced him that some new departures were essential. Peter the Great was a victorious leader, but of exceptional intelligence and ruthless energy. A giant, standing 6 feet 8 inches, he was eager to move his country more fully into the Western military and cultural orbit without making it fully Western. He traveled widely in the West, incognito, seeking Western allies for a crusade against Turkish power in Europe, for which he found little enthusiasm. He also visited many Western manufacturing centers, even working as a ship's carpenter in Holland. Through these activities, he gained an interest in Western science and technology. He brought scores of Western artisans back with him to Russia. Tsarist autocracy of Peter the Great. In politics, Peter was clearly an autocrat. He put down revolts against his rule with great cruelty, in one case executing some of the ringleaders personally. He had no interest in the parliamentary features of Western centers such as Holland, seizing instead on the absolute currents on the West at this time. Peter enhanced the power of the Russian state by using it as a reform force, trying to show that even aristocratic habits could be modified by state decree. Peter also extended the earlier policy of recruiting bureaucrats from outside aristocratic ranks and giving them noble titles to reward bureaucratic service. Here was a key of means of freeing the state from exclusive dependence on aristocratic officials. Peter imitated Western military organization, creating a special trained fighting force that put down local militias. Furthermore, he set up a secret police to prevent dissent and to supervise the bureaucracy. He paralleled an earlier Chinese innovation, but went well beyond the bureaucratic control impulses of Western absolutists at that time. Peter's chancery of secret police survived under different names and with changing functions to the 1990s. It was reinstated after 1917 by a revolutionary regime that in other respects worked to undo key features of the Tsarist system. Peter's foreign policy maintained many well-established lines. See map 18.2. He attacked the Ottoman Empire, but he won no great victories. He warred with Sweden, at the time one of the leading northern powers of Europe, and gained territory on the eastern coast of the Baltic Sea, thus reducing Sweden to a second-rate military status. Russia now had a window on the sea, including a largely ice-free port. From this time onward, Russia became a major factor in European diplomatic and military arrangements. The Tsar commemorated Russia's shift to interest westward by moving his capital from Moscow to a new Baltic city that he named St. Petersburg. What Westernization meant. Overall, Peter concentrated on improvements in political organization, on selected economic development, and on cultural change. He tried to streamline Russia's small bureaucracy and alter military structure by using Western organizational principles. He created a more well-defined military hierarchy while developing functionally specialized bureaucratic departments. He also improved the army's weaponry and, with aid from Western advisors, created the first Russian Navy. He completely eliminated the old noble councils, creating a set of advisors under his control. Peter's ministers systemized law codes to extend through the whole empire and revised the tax system, with taxes on ordinary Russian peasants increasingly steadily. New training institutes were established for aspiring bureaucrats and officers. One way to bring talented non-nobles into the system. Peter's economic efforts focused on building up metallurgical and mining industries, using Russia's extensive iron holdings to feed state-running munitions and shipbuilding facilities. Without urbanizing extensively or developing a large commercial class, Peter's reforms changed the Russian economy. Landlords were rewarded for using serf labor to staff new manufacturing operations. This gave Russia the internal economic means to maintain a substantial military presence for almost 2 centuries. Finally, Peter was eager to make Russia culturally respectable in Western eyes. Before Peter the Great, it was a custom in upper-class marriages for the father of the bride to pass a small whip to the groom. This symbolized the transfer of male power over women. Peter, knowing that upper-class women had greater freedom in the West, abolished this practice. He also encouraged upper-class women to wear Western-style clothing and attend public cultural events. He found support among women as a result. He also reduced a source of embarrassment among Westerners in Russia, who otherwise could easily point to uncivilized treatment of women. But, as with most of his reforms, he made no move to change gender relations among the masses of Russian peasants. Peter was eager to cut the Russian elite off from its traditions, to enhance state power, and to commit the elite to new identities. He required male nobles to shave their beards, figure 18.3, and wear Western clothes. In symbolic ceremonies, he cut off the long Mongol-type sleeves and pigtails that were characteristic of the boyars. Thus, traditional appearance was forcibly altered as part of Western-oriented change, although only the upper class was involved. Cultural change supplemented bureaucratic training. Peter and his successors found scientific institutions and academies along Western lines, and serious discussion on the latest scientific and technical findings became common. At the elite level, Peter built Russia into a Western cultural zone, and Western fads and fashions extended easily into the glittering new capital city. Ballet, initially encouraged in the French royal court, was imported and became a Russian specialty. The use of Christmas trees came from Germany. This westernization effort had severe features that can be compared with imitation processes in other societies later on. In the first place, the changes were selective. Peter did not try and touch the ordinary people of Russia or to involve them in the technological and intellectual aspects of westernization. In this sense, Peter's reforms, which some historians see as part of the modernization program, fell short of what modernization would later turn out to involve. New manufacturing involved serf labor that heavily coerced, spelled C-O-E-R-C-E-D, not the wage labor spreading in the West. Not the wage labor spreading in the West. There was no interest in building the kind of worldwide export economy characteristic on the West. Peter wanted economic development to support military strength rather than to achieve wider commercial goals. Finally, new political ideas Finally, westernization was meant to encourage the autocratic state, not to challenge it with some of the new political ideas circulating in the West. This was real change, but it did not fold Russia into Western civilization outright. Selectivity was crucial, and there was no interest in abandoning particularly Russian goals. Furthermore, the westernization that did occur brought hostile responses. Many peasants resented the westernized airs and expenses at their landlords, some of whom no longer even knew Russian but spoke only French. Elements of the elite opposed Peter's thirst for change, arguing that Russian traditions were superior to those of the West. As one priest wrote to Tsar Alexis, "You freed the foreigners too well. Instead of bidding your folk to cling to the old customs." The tensions continued in Russian history from this point forward, leading to the important cycles of enthusiasm and revulsion toward Western values. Here was another key component of Russian development, still vivid in the early 21st century: consolidation under Catherine the Great. The death of Peter the Great in 1724 was followed by several decades of weak rule, dominated part by power plays among army officers who guided the selection of several ineffective emperors and empresses. The weakness of Tsardom in these years encouraged new grumblings about undue westernization and some new initiatives by church officials eager to gain more freedom to maneuver, but no major new policy directions were set. Russian territorial expansion continued with several clashes with the Ottoman Empire and further exploration and settlement in Siberia. In 1761, Peter III, nephew of Peter the Great's youngest daughter, reached the throne. He was mentally unstable, but his wife, a German-born princess who changed her name to Catherine and later known as Catherine the Great, figure 18.4, soon took matters in hand. Catherine II the Great, known as Catherine 1729 to 1796, is one of the fascinating women leaders of history. Catherine II the Great, 1729 to 1796, is one of the fascinating women leaders of history. Born a Prussian princess, she converted to the Orthodox faith after her marriage to the heir of the Russian throne was arranged. Her married life was miserable, with frequent threats of divorce from her husband. She also disliked her son, the future Tsar Paul I. Officers of the palace guard installed her as empress in 1762. The Tsar was later murdered, possibly with Catherine's consent. Catherine actively defended the powers of the central monarch She put down another vigorous peasant uprising led by Emelian Pugachev, having Pugachev himself slaughtered. She used the Pugachev rebellion as an excuse to extend the powers of the central government in regional affairs. Catherine's reign combined genuine reform interests with her need to consolidate power as a truly Russian ruler, a combination that explains the complexities of her policies. Like Peter the Great, Catherine was a selective westernizer, as her instruction of 1767, see the document section, clearly demonstrated. She flirted with the ideas of the Enlightenment, importing several French philosophers for visits, and she established commissions to discuss new law codes with other Western-style measures, including reduction of traditional severe punishments. Catherine also encouraged upper-class education and the arts and literature. Catherine's policies were not always consistent with her image. However, she gave new powers to the nobility over their serfs, maintaining a trade-off that had been developing over the previous 2 centuries, and staffed it as bureaucrats and officers. They were in this sense a service aristocracy, not an independent force. They also accepted into their ranks newly ennobled officials chosen by the Tsars. In return, however, most of the actual administration over local peasants, except for those on government-run estates, was wielded by the noble landlords. These landlords could requisition peasant labor, levy taxes in money and goods, and even impose punishments for crimes because landlord-dominated courts administered local justice. Catherine increased the harshness of punishments nobles could decree for their serfs. Catherine patronized Western-style art and architecture, encouraging leading nobles to tour the West and even send their children to be educated there. But she also tried to avoid political influence from the West. When the Great French Revolution broke out in 1789, Catherine was quick to close Russia's doors to the seditious, it's spelled Seditious, writings of liberals and Democrats. She also censored a small but emerging band of Russian intellectuals who urged reforms along Western lines. One of the first Western-inspired radicals, a noble named Radishev, who sought abolition of serfdom and more liberal political rule, was vigorously harassed by Catherine's police, and his writings were banned. Catherine pursued the tradition of Russian expansion, and with energy and success, see map 18.3. She resumed campaigns against the Ottoman Empire, winning new territories in Central Asia, including the Crimea bordering the Black Sea. The Russian-Ottoman contest began a central diplomatic issue for both powers, and Russia became increasingly ascendant. Catherine accelerated the colonization of Russia's holdings in Siberia and encouraged further exploration, claiming the territory of Alaska in Russia's name. Russian explorers also moved down the Pacific coast of North America into what is now North California, and tens of thousands of pioneers spread over Siberia. Finally, Catherine pressed Russia's interests in Europe, playing power politics with Prussia and Austria, though without risking major wars. She increased Russian interference in Polish affairs. The Polish government was extremely weak, almost paralyzed by a parliamentary system that let members of the nobility veto any significant measure, and this invited interests of more powerful neighbors. Russia was able to win agreements with Austria and Prussia for the partition of Poland. 3 partitions in 1772, 1793, and 1795 eliminated Poland as an independent state, and Russia held the lion's share of the spoils. The basis for further Russian involvement in European affairs had obviously been created, and this would show in Russia's ultimate role in putting down the French armies of Napoleon after 1812, the first time Russian troops moved into the heartland of Western Europe.